Good afternoon, everyone. The lights went out and the silence. That was a really great way to enter. um, Welcome to the Urban Institute, and thank you guys for being here today for our first data talk that we're having in our new building here in 2019. And I'm really glad that all of you found us and that we have such a great crowd for what is going to be a really important deep dive into a lot of the data and analysis behind many of the important headlines that we've been hearing about in the housing market as it relates to homeownership rates, homeownership gaps, and the racial homeownership gap in particular. My name is Elena McCargo. I'm the Vice President of the Housing Finance Policy Center. My co-director, Lori Goodman, is here on the front row too with me, and we bring these data talk series fairly regularly. They're lunchtime events that we really kind of go deep for people that are super interested in housing policy and very interested in the data and analytics that go behind a lot of the information that we share here from Urban. So we really appreciate all of you joining us today. I think this is one of the larger data talk events that we've had, and so it's really nice to see so many of you here. And apologies for having lunch but no tables for you, but that's because we were so really crowded on this topic and so busy. A couple of just really quick housekeeping points. We're going to have several presentations of the data that happen initially. While we're doing that, we have an online audience, and here in the room you can tweet using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban to communicate and sort of talk about these issues online and start the conversation there. We're going to be referring to and seeing a lot of research papers that are in depth. All of those can be found online on the event page for this, so you can refer back to those resources. Just today, the Urban Institute's Housing Finance Policy Center did launch a resource page on urban.org that you can look at, which has a compilation of all of the research that we have done over the last couple of years on the topic of Black homeownership, and really gives you an opportunity to see just a host of information, data points, and really important pieces that I think you all might want to check out. So you can find that on urban.org. And let's see, other housekeeping matters. Those are the main ones. So we'll have some Q&A at the end, some time for that after the discussion panel. We're going to bring up a couple of first presentations on in-depth research pieces that have been done, and so those scholars will be joining us first, and then we will have a discussion session with our discussants. I think everyone should have been able to pick up bios and the agenda, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with introductions in terms of background, but the biographies for all the speakers today can be found in those bios. If you didn't get one on your way in, you can certainly get one on your way out or anytime during this session. So without further ado, I want to introduce, and I want to kind of introduce the panel and setup, and then kind of get right into it because there's a lot of data to cover. Interestingly and very timely, and several of you who we've been partnering with over the last several years on this topic have sent me two really interesting headlines that came out of the news yesterday. Joe Ventrone, I see you back there. You're one of the people that sent this to me. It was really interesting to see and made it just so timely as we're talking about this issue and why it matters so much and why this homeownership gap matters so much. One was a wave of Hispanic buyers shores up U.S. housing market. Homeownership rate for Hispanics has increased more in recent years than any other ethnic group. And then right after that, in the Wall Street Journal, Black homeownership drops to an all-time low. So we are seeing something right now that's quite staggering, frankly, quite phenomenal. The lowest homeownership rates for the Black race that we have seen in over 50 years. Since the Fair Housing Act was enacted, and since the housing crisis, where everyone is seeing an economic recovery, we are continuing to see declines in the Black homeownership rate, and that is something to raise an alarm about. We think that's something that's worth talking about, that everyone should be focused on this issue, and that we really need to understand what's underneath these numbers, why these things are happening, and what possible policy and practice interventions may need to go in place to fix that. One of the things we say, and I'll stop at this because we're going to get into it a lot. this is not just a national housing crisis. It is very much a local housing crisis. And so the need for policy intervention, both at the national level and the local level, is greater than it's ever been. And specific focus on these issues about what's happening in the race disparities, their differences in those markets, and it's really important to understand what's happening and underneath the numbers in each of those markets, because there are different dynamics at play. And so I just want to mention that, and then we'll get into that a lot more as the panel goes on. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up our first speaker, who's Jung Choi here from the Urban Institute. She's a research associate. Jung is going to talk about the Black-white homeownership gap research that she's been doing. And I would like to also just shout out and thank Living Cities for their support of this research work that we've been doing. And I'll bring Jung up to get us started. Jung, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so to go down a little bit. And thank you, Elena, for the introduction. So in this section, I'm going to talk about three things. First is the overall gap in the Black-white homeownership and wealth over time, which Elena actually talked a lot about in her introduction. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit more about why it's important in using some of the recent data work that we've done. And the finally, I will take a closer look at the disparities of Black-white homeownership rate across MSAs and try to figure out what are driving those disparities across different cities in the US, right? So I can almost skip this slide because Elena just mentioned about it. So we do see that currently the Black homeownership rate is the lowest of all racial group, and it also has reached a historically low level since 1960s. We actually see that there's a greater gap in the Black-white homeownership rate than what we saw in the 1960s, and Black have been experiencing the slowest recovery from the housing crisis since 2007. Right, so a little bit more numbers. So between year 2000 and 2017, Black homeownership rate dropped by almost 5 percentage points, while Hispanics and other race and ethnic groups, which majorities are Asian, have actually experienced an increase in homeownership rate. So if we had the Black homeownership rate, the same level as what it was in 2000, right now in the US housing market, there will be about 770,000 more Black homeowners. Right, and this is a data which were striking to us. First, the yellow is the white homeownership rate, and the blue bar is the Black homeownership rate. And as expected, as the level of educational attainment increases, in general, so does the homeownership rate increase. But however, what we find here is that the Black with a college degree, a 4-year college degree, have lower homeownership rate compared to whites without a high school diploma. And homeownership rate, as you know, is highly related to wealth. And we see that as of 2016, which is the most recent data from the Survey of Consumer Finance, the net wealth of Black is only about 1/10 of the wealth of whites. So to wrap up the first session, we see a declining trend in Black wealth and homeownership, which the two variables are highly correlated. And again, compared to other race and ethnic groups, Black homeownership has not recovered since the crisis. So why is homeownership important? So I'll briefly touch on this topic with a couple of slides. So as we know, homeownership rate is highly correlated with future wealth. So last year we did a study which looked at the median housing wealth at the age near retirement, 60 and 61. So the blue bar here shows the median housing wealth at age 60 or 61 using the PSID, and the yellow bar here is the median value of the first home. And we kind of calculated the number by the age that the person bought their first home. And what this figure is showing that is that if you bought your home between age 25 and 34, you have the greatest amount of housing wealth at the age near retirement. And another interesting finding from this figure is that for those who bought their house at the age below 25, they actually spent the least money in purchasing their first home. So they spent about less than $70,000 to buy their first home. So compared to the initial investment that they made in housing, they actually have the greatest return in terms of the future house value. So they're the ones who gain the greatest bang for the buck. Right, so a couple of interesting patterns are related to how the Black purchase and sustain their homeownership and their future housing wealth. And the first thing that we found is that Blacks, on average, buy homes later in life. So here we kind of like calculated what the proportion of both proportion of Blacks and white by the first age of home purchase. And we find that almost 90% of white households have bought their house before age 35, compared to only slightly above half of the Blacks who did so. And we also see that there are a significant number of Black population who have never owned up until their age 60. And this delay in purchasing home is obviously related to the lower housing wealth at the age of retirement. Second pattern we found is that Blacks tend to buy cheaper first home with a greater amount of debt. So here we show both the average value of the first home and also the average value of first mortgage debt by both Black and white population. And you'll see that the first value of home is higher for whites. There's about $13,000 differences between white and Black. On the other hand, despite buying cheaper homes, Black actually pay greater amount of mortgage to buy that home. So there's about $16,000 gap between Black and white first mortgage debt. So Blacks have greater leverage at the time of purchase, and that also affects their future housing wealth. The final pattern that I would like to highlight is that Blacks, after buying their first homes, are more likely to switch to renters, which means that they're less likely to sustain their home ownership. So, for example, if you compare those people who bought their first homes after age 45, you see that only 9% of whites switched to renters after first owning their home, compared to more than 1/3 of Blacks. 34% of Blacks switched to renters after first owning their home. Right, so this all translates to a lower housing wealth of Blacks near the retirement age, but not only this, I want to also highlight the fact that wealth and homeownership transfers from parent to children, so there's an intergenerational aspects here. So last year we did a research which found that children of homeowner parents are about 4 to 5 percentage point more likely to be homeowners, all else equal. And we also found that a 10% increase in parental wealth increases child's likelihood of owning by about 0.15 to 0.20 percentage point. And in our research, we found that parental wealth and home ownership combined explains about 12% of the Black-white home ownership gap of young adults. So now the final session, we're going to spend a lot more time on looking at Black-white homeownership gap across cities. We're first going to look at some gaps in terms of numbers, and then we're going to kind of look more deeply into what other key factors are that explains the gaps across cities. And in this presentation, I'm going to use the word city and MSA interchangeably. So the first map shows that there is no single city, unfortunately, in the US that actually has closed the Black-white home ownership gap. So the Black-white home ownership gap ranges from 10% to over 50% across US cities, but there's no single cities right now that have closed the gap, although we see a huge variation across cities in terms of the homeownership gap between Black and white population. So let's look a little bit closer into a city. So here is the list of top 10 cities with the smallest homeownership gap and the top 10 cities with the largest homeownership gap. And we see that Minneapolis in 2017 was the city with the greatest homeownership gap of 51 percentage points. And Charleston, South Carolina was the city with the lowest gap of 15 percentage point. And note that this is just among 105 cities, so there are like smaller cities with smaller gaps, but we only included the cities for statistical accuracy. So between the highest and the lowest gap city, there's about 36 percentage point gap. So there is a huge variation between those two cities. And following the crisis, most cities have experienced a decline in Black homeownership. So this bar shows that among the 31 cities with over 100,000 Black population, Black households, only 4 cities have actually experienced an increase in home ownership rate, and the remaining 27 experienced a decline. In terms of white homeownership rate, there's about half the cities actually experienced an increase and half experienced a decline. And also for the cities which experienced a decline, the extent of Black homeownership decline was much greater than the extent of white homeownership decline. So we actually observed some cities seeing decline up to 10 percentage points. So you see Memphis, Columbus, Riverside, and Detroit. Those are the 4 cities which experienced the greatest decline among those 31 cities. Right, so with this, I'm gonna take you to some of the regression analysis. So we kind of wanted to explore more about what is driving the gap in the Black-white homeownership rate across cities. So in order to do so, we collected data from decennial census and ACS in year 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015, and 2017. And here again, for statistical accuracy, we only use the data from the MSAs with Black population over 40,000 as of 2017. So that leaves us with 105 MSAs each year. So there's slightly over 500 observation for our analysis. And in the right side, there's a table which shows the summary statistics. So these are all the control variables that we included in our regression analysis. So we see that in those 105 cities, there's 30 percentage point gap in the Black-white homeownership rate. We also control for age, education, the share of households with female heads, marital status, unemployment, and median income. And I would like to point out the variable below median income, which is the share of households who fall under the lowest quartile area income. And you can see that 40% of Blacks fall below this threshold compared to only 20% of whites, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in our regression analysis. And we were lucky, thankful for Freddie for providing us this FICO score data, which we didn't have. So we do have median FICO score and FICO's distribution by both Black and whites for each MSAs, which we were also able to control in our regression analysis. And also we have some more MSA aggregate level variables. I would like to point out dissimilarity index, which is a measure of racial segregation. So this index is higher if the MSA has census tract with more concentrated Black population. So if MSA has certain census tract with a greater share of Black population, that gives a higher rate of residential segregation. And we also control for building permits per household to capture supply and median house value and rent for affordability. And we also control for GDP per capita and population. So I have 3 regression tables. So I have many numbers here, so you don't really have to focus on all of them. Maybe you'll have more time to go back home and look at the numbers more closely, so I'll just point out some of the interesting things that we saw. First, I would like to point out that the median income gap, this shows that if the Black median income is relatively higher compared to the white median income in that MSA, then that city has a higher Black homeownership rate relative to white. So that means that there's a lower gap because Black obviously have lower homeownership rate than whites. But if we include actually the share of households that fall below the bottom quartile area income, the median income coefficient becomes insignificant, and it's actually the distribution that really drives this gap in the home ownership rate. And we do find that in places where with greater racial segregation, there is a greater gap in the Black-white homeownership rate. But once we control for other variables, that variable becomes insignificant. And finally, I would like to point out that in places with greater supply, there are less gap in the Black-white homeownership rate. And all the others are pretty much what we will expect as like the FICO score gap and the affordability indices. And finally, we kind of wanted to check if the key factors that affect white homeownership are the same as the key factors that affect Black homeownership. Everything remained pretty much the same, except for the racial segregation index. In places where there's greater racial segregation, Blacks have lower homeownership rate, but that effect goes away if we include things like FICO scores and other things. But for white homeownership rate, we find that after including all the control variables, still places with greater racial segregation, white homeownership rate is higher in those cities. And we do find that places where median house value is greater than median rent, Black homeownership is lower. We don't find that trend for whites, but then we do find that in places where median house value is greater than median income, those places are where the white homeownership rate is lower. So final slide with 1 minute to go. We kind of wanted to see what among all the numbers that I showed you, what are the key factors that explain the Black-white homeownership gap. So in the OACA decomposition, we find that marital composition, FICO score distribution, income distribution, and age are the 4 key factors that explains a large proportion of the gap. This is after controlling for racial segregation, the housing permits, but then you can't really compare those numbers because those are the same for both Black and white living in the same MSAs. But after controlling for those, these red things were the 4 things that stood out. But then I would also like to close with that even after including all these variables, there's about 17% of gap, Black-white homeownership gap, which remains to be explained. Thank you very much.
So we're going to bring up, thank you so much, Jung. It was great. We're going to bring up our next paper discussion and our two co-authors from this, Arthur Alkland, assistant professor from the University of Washington, and Susan Wachter, who is with the Wharton School at Penn. Please come on up, and they're going to present their data, and then I'll be back for the discussion component. There you go.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with so many old friends and to be so near my old digs of HUD in this beautiful, wonderful building. Considering a topic which I think is critical, not only for specific segments of the population, but if I may say so, for the future of democracy in America, and that's ownership. And majority home ownership gap is as high as it's been for 50 years. We just heard the news yesterday of a low, 50-year low for Black homeownership of rates of 41%, and it's persistent and growing. It matters, obviously. The homeownership access matters for opportunity, and the gap matters for equal access to opportunity. So what we do in our work is compare data points over 3 periods of time, 1989, 2005, and 2013, although we are in process of updating that. We choose these 3 periods of time because we have the similar information over these 3 periods, so we could replicate the results for these 3 periods. And the 3 periods are important, as you will see in a moment, because despite this very long-term data, which shows the vast increase in homeownership rate across segments of the population right after World War II, and then what looks like persistent differences with increases recently, that's not exactly right. There's important changes over time in these data points, which I will show in a moment as we drill into the period from 1994 forward. First, you see that there is some decrease in the gap starting around 1980 and late 1970s, 1980. And this is consistent with the passing of landmark anti-discrimination legislation. But nonetheless, the gap persists. But I do want to point to, and I'm going to go forward once and then come back, I do want to point to actually in 2004, and this is prior, 2004, prior to the blowout in housing prices, prior to the real blowout in mortgage securitization, which was 2005, 2006, homeownership rates as a whole peaked in the United States in 2004. Housing prices peaked in 2006. And the gap was minimized in 2003, 2004. In fact, Black homeownership rates almost hit 50%. So if you took a picture snapshot at that point of the previous few years, the increase for the decade from 1994 to 2004 looked good. So we might ask a question of why. In fact, we do ask that question of why in our research. So let's go back. And let's just quickly, for this audience, I need not say why access to homeownership matters, but let me just repeat that it is the main component of wealth for most households. It is a force-saving mechanism. It does explain most of the difference in wealth across segments of the population. It is a hedge against future price and rent increases, which in a time of gentrification matters more than ever. And it does provide access to public services in high amenity areas, as well as civic engagement. So let's look at this slide again for a moment and notice 2 things. Notice that in the 2000-2004 period, we have this rapid increase, really starts in the late 1990s, in Black homeownership, which is the blue line, and the yellow line, which is Hispanic, also increases, and then it's steady downhill from 2004 after. Now, we do know from other research that it is not the pro-homeownership policies for minorities that were put into place, that is the Community Reinvestment Act, the housing goals. There's a slew of very impressive empirical evidence that shows that none of that explains the housing bubble. The timing is just off, as well as econometric evidence to the contrary. But it is also true that in the aftermath of the crisis, 2005 afterwards, there is also a considerable number of econometric studies that point to Black homeownership particularly suffering in the aftermath. And it's not just minorities, it's also, of course, young people. In general, millennials have not recovered. It's slight increase, but very slight recently, and certainly Black millennials have not recovered. And it's approximately a little bit over one-third Black, a little bit over one-third millennials are homeowners, but there is also a historically high percentage, almost one-third of millennials, that still are living at home. So we do need to look at what matters and what doesn't. And just very briefly in our research, we look at endowments, and by endowments it is what we can measure over 89, 2005, and in the most recent that we have. And we see in 2005 this decline in the gap, and then we see the increase in the gap. And in short, the increase in the gap is not explained by permanent income. It's not explained by local factors. It's not explained by characteristics of population, marital status, et cetera. So it's unknowns, which perhaps includes the tightening of credit, the aftermath, credit scores in particular, and also wealth. So turn to our particular results. Arthur will lay them out. Thank you.
So in our paper with Jason, we try to look at a relatively simple question of qualifying that gap, that minority white homeownership gap, how it has evolved since 1989, and what are some of the factors that contribute to explaining those changes. The data we use is one of those great public survey that exists, the American Housing Survey, that has really detailed and consistent information on both household and housing characteristics. So we used 3 waves of the survey. At the time we did the study, the latest wave didn't include in the public data the information we needed about house value for that study, but we are in the process of updating it. In this paper, we looked at the 1989, 2005, and 2013 waves of the survey. And we use a lot of the information that is available, both capturing some of the household characteristics, both in terms of social demographics as well as economic and financial characteristics, as well as information about the housing units, what unit household they're occupying, and what does that tell about their preference for different type of housing. The survey lacks information about household wealth, credit, and employment history. And we know that those affect a household ability to access credit. So among the 3 underwriting variables that are commonly used, LTV, DTI, and FICO, we are really able to capture only DTI adequately, and we don't have good measures for loan to value and FICO score. Nonetheless, we are able to estimate tenure choice logit model that controlling for household endowments and their location, we can estimate whether they would prefer to own or to rent, and what are the factors that explain their preference for ownership over renting. We decompose the disparities in ownership rates into the share that are accounted for by those endowments and a residual share that is unexplained. As Susan mentioned, that unexplained share can kind of compose 2 components. One is potential omitted variables such as individual and parental wealth that the Urban Institute study showed was very critical to explain access to homeownership. Another element is the lack of the credit score information. But that residual portion also captures some of the unobserved barrier to access homeownership that minority households, particularly Black households, are still facing today, which are different lending practices and their legacy that can explain some of the differences in propensity to become homeowners. We try to the extent possible to control for household characteristics that we know drive the homeownership decision. In particular, we are able to have good measures of permanent income, which mean the income that households are predicted to earn over their life cycle based on characteristics such as their current age, their education level, their household characteristics, as well as control for factors such as age, marital status, family size, and some control for the location of the unit. As we can see for those 3 waves, there are large and persistent differences in criteria that are really important drivers of the homeownership decision. In particular, with regard to both measure of income, both transitory income, so the income households are earning at the point of the survey, and permanent income, the income they are predicted to earn over the course of their life. We can see that Black households have much lower level of income, and Hispanic household as well, substantially lower level of income than white. In addition, one of the points that is quite striking when you look at the data is that while for white household, there has been an overall net increase in income over the 1989-2013 period. Those are all controlled for inflation measures. So this net increase in real income over that time period for both Black and Hispanic household, while there was an increase between 1989 and 2005 that contributed to that increase in homeownership that is well documented. When we look at the 2005-2013 period, the decrease was such that it more than wiped out that increase in the previous period. And over the entire 1989 to 2013 period, we observe a net decline in income for those groups. To give you a sense of the magnitude of those decline, for both Black and Hispanic between 1989 and 2013, real income decreased by more than 4%. In addition, when looking at the housing characteristics of the market and the properties in which Black and Hispanic households are located and that they are consuming, we can see that there are also strong differences. So we use two different measures of ratios relative to rent. The first one is the price to rent ratio, and the second one is the value to rent ratios. Both of those ratios capture different dimensions that are predicted to impact homeownership decision. The price to rent ratio is a market-wide measure that captures quality adjusted average price divided by rent. So that's in areas where the price to rent ratios are higher, that should be disincentivized to become homeowners. And the value to rent ratio is a property-specific measures that is based on the property in which the household reside and identify the expected price appreciation, essentially, of the user cost for that household. And so the effects are expected to be going in different direction, with higher price to rent ratio being associated with a lower demand for homeownership, while higher value to rent ratio are expected to increase the demand for homeownership. So we can see again that for both of those measures, Black household exhibit and Hispanic household exhibit quite different pattern from white household. On the price to rent ratio, that will go towards pushing Black homeownership further than Hispanic homeownership, but the value to rent ratio is supportive of higher homeownership rate for Hispanic. This can be explained by the very different geography that persists in the location of those two groups, with Hispanic still concentrated mostly in the West and Southwest, while Black are more located in the South, Midwest, and Northeast region, with very different housing market and residential trends that can make homeownership a different proposition depending on the trends in local market. Our key findings, focusing on Black household first, really show that over that's 25 years period that we are covering with our data, there has been an increase in the overall white-Black homeownership gap, and the share of that gap that can be explained by differences in endowment, so differences in household characteristics and their location, has decreased. While the endowment explained about 2/3 of the gap in 1989, it only explained about half of the gap in 2013. And so that really raises the question of what has changed in the economy, what has changed in the processes that constrain access to homeownership that have affected Black household more than white household. And so going back to the slide that John presented on the difference in homeownership rate for graduates with a high school degree versus college degree for Black versus white, the improvement in endowment that could have resulted in closing the gap by about 2 percentage points only partially counterbalance other phenomena outside of those fundamental changes in things like income and education, and raise really the importance of finding ways to directly target that gap. When looking at Hispanic homeownership, it's a quite different trends, and in particular, one of the things that really distinguishes the experience for Hispanic household is the role of immigration trends and recent immigrants that tend to have lower demand for homeownership and lower ability to act on that demand. And as the share of native born increases, we have seen a change in the share that can be explained by the endowment. And the endowment capture a much larger proportion once you control for citizenship. So looking at the 2013 data, once you include citizenship, the residual share is relatively small, about 12 percentage points, which is still substantial, but much smaller than for Black household, where the residual is about 19 percentage points. So in conclusion, what we find in our study is that this large and persistent gap in homeownership outcome between minority household and white household is in part explained by the lower and decreasing permanent income of minority household, but that only a portion of that gap is explained by those fundamental differences in endowment, and that particularly during the 2005 to 2013 period, Black household saw an increase in the gap that is unexplained, that might be consistent with increased impact of tightened credit, more instability in job market, more negative effect of foreclosures, both directly for households who had become homeowners in the 2004-2006 period, but also at the neighborhood level, being concentrated in communities that were more directly affected by the foreclosure crisis. In addition, unmeasured differences in wealth need to be taken into account, including parental wealth, as well as differences in credit records, which are also likely to contribute to the unexplained portion of the gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur and Susan. So we're going to bring up two senior economists, one from Freddie Mac, and that's Jay Aday, who's going to come up first. And then David Vandenbroek is going to come up, who's the senior economist at HUD, to talk and discuss a little bit about what we just saw, and then to kick off that discussion, and then also share a little bit of research that they've independently been doing at each of those places, and then the whole team will come back up for discussion. Thank you.
So hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Elena and Laurie, for putting together a great session and including me as a participant on a very important topic that is extremely relevant for both academics as well as practitioners. So by now, we all know that Black homeownership is Blacks are 30% less likely to own homes compared to whites, as the figure suggests, and the racial gap in homeownership rate has been widening over time. So two very interesting papers were presented to address this gap. I'll first summarize the two papers and then present some of our own work at Freddie Mac on this topic. So I'll first start with Arthur and Susan's paper. So it's a very interesting paper. They estimate tenure choice models that incorporate household and market level endowments to understand racial gap in homeownership rate over time. What I really like about this paper is that they include permanent income as a measure of household endowment instead of current household income. So according to permanent income hypothesis, consumers tend to smooth consumption over time based on expected future income rather than current income. So permanent income can serve as a proxy for expected future returns to schooling, parental wealth, intergenerational transfer, etc. The table gives their main results. So they decompose the racial gap in homeownership rate into two effects: the endowment effect, which captures all their controls, and the residual effect, which captures the unexplained part. The two add to the total estimated homeownership gap at any given time. So the big takeaway is that unlike Hispanics and Asians, for Blacks, the residual effect has increased substantially over time, emerging as the main reason for widening white-Black gap. A few things that the residual effect may be capturing are unmeasured household wealth differences, which impact the ability to access down payment assistance for homeownership. So Freddie Mac recently published a report where it used National Survey of Mortgage Originations to show that the share of home buyers who use gifts and grants from family and friends to meet their down payment requirements is around 25%, so it's a non-trivial number. And since that channel is weakened for Blacks, especially after the financial crisis, that could be driving some of the widening gap. Another important characteristic is that may be driving the residual effect is differences in credit quality, which they cannot observe in their data, but is somewhat accounted for in the next paper by Jung. So the motivation behind this paper is that since crisis, the homeownership gap at the MSA level has increased. So she investigates to what extent the white-Black gap in homeownership rate at MSA level is driven by the socio-demographic factors or the credit attributes. So she is able to include FICO scores to account for credit attributes. Her main finding is summarized in the bar chart, which illustrates the racial difference in FICO scores indeed substantially explains the racial gap in homeownership rate, along with the racial differences in marital status, income, and age distribution. Overall, she's able to explain 83% of the gap, which is substantial. Since this is a work in progress, I have a few suggestions. Like, I would like to see how these factors changed before and after the crisis. Also, to tease out the geographic impact, can you separate the high and low cost MSAs to see how the contribution of the factors are similar or different for some of these factors? Because our work at Freddie Mac shows that most mortgage ready population who have higher FICO scores are concentrated in the high cost areas. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about our own work at Freddie Mac. So while the existing literature sought to identify the determinants of racial gap in individual tenure choice, mostly based on credit proxies and self-reported survey data, a very few studies have actually considered the role of actual measures of credit risk likely used by the banks, particularly obtained from the administrative data. So my co-authored paper with Larisse Brown at Freddie Mac fills this gap in the literature. So we use uniquely constructed anonymized credit bureau data to analyze the racial gap in transition into mortgage ownership by 2018 for a sample of households who were renters in 2012. So a little bit about our data. So basically, it's a 2% random anonymized sample of consumers with credit records drawn in 2016. We are able to get their credit profiles as well as their household level information and their race and ethnicity information. And then we are able to track them backwards in 2012 as well as forward in 2018. So it's a 3-year consumer credit household panel data. So using this data, we first look at the 2018 mortgage ownership status by 2012 mortgage ownership status, which is in panel A. So for example, for non-Hispanic whites, around 56% did not have any mortgages in either year. 25% had mortgages in both years. Around 9.5% had mortgages in 2012, but no mortgages in 2018. And most interestingly for us, around 9% had no mortgages in 2012, but had mortgages by 2018. And that's 5% for Blacks. The second panel is basically expresses the new mortgage holders in 2018 as a percent of 2012 non-mortgage holders. So that's 14% for non-Hispanic whites and 6% for Blacks. So the white-black gap and transition rate into mortgage ownership is around 7.5%. Panel C looks at the transitioning into mortgage ownership from 2012 to 2016, and that just says that the white-black gap into transition from 2012 to 2016 was around 5.8%. So the racial gap in transition rate is widening, which is consistent with the homeownership trend, gap trend as well. So the next, in the first step, we basically estimate a tenure choice model that controls for credit attributes along with the other usual suspects. So a dependent variable takes 1 if consumers didn't have mortgages in 2012 but have 1 by 2018 and 0 otherwise. So the table here just gives the marginal effect from our logistic regression exercise. The rows highlighted in yellow are the credit attributes that we are able to observe and control for. So we control for FICO scores, various measures of DTIs, bankruptcy indicators, delinquency, foreclosure indicators. We are also able to control for missing FICO indicators as well as indicators of thin credit, a thin credit without any severe, without clean thin credit, which is basically thin credit but no derogatory credit history. And then we are also able to include an indicator capturing whether consumers inquired for mortgages in 12 months prior to September 2012, which serves as a proxy for homeownership preferences. So the big takeaway is that consumers who are non-Hispanic white, of ages 36 to 45, married, higher household income growth are more likely to transition into new mortgages. While FICO scores and mortgage inquiries have positive effect on homeownership propensity, delinquencies have negative effect on homeownership propensity. So then next, to understand the racial patterns in transition rate, we look into racial difference in distribution of various characteristics, which is given in the table here. So it reports the mean values for various characteristics by race and ethnicity. So basically the big takeaway is typically Blacks are skewed younger, are more likely to be single, have lower household income growth, lower FICO, are more likely to have delinquencies, and are less likely to have inquired for mortgages compared to non-Hispanic whites. So lastly, we put the two pieces together to investigate to what extent the racial gap in transition rate is explained by racial differences in characteristics. This is the Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition result. The blue bar gives the white-black gap, and the orange bar gives the white-Hispanic gap. So credit worthiness, which captures FICO score, missing FICO indicator, thin file indicator, and various measures of DTIs, contributes substantially to the white minority gap. Severe derogatory credit, which captures delinquencies, bankruptcies, and foreclosures, and mortgage demand, which captures enquiries, explain substantial part of white minority gap as well. Both the minority groups are skewed younger, so age, which is captured in individual demographics, actually shrinks the gap. So in these ways, these two minority groups have very similar experience. But there are key differences in experience across the two minority groups. So for example, household composition, which includes marital status, explains or contributes to the white-black gap much more than the white-Hispanic gap, because blacks tend to be more likely to be single, and singles have less likely to transition into mortgage ownership. Income growth contributes to the white-black gap, but shrinks the white-Hispanic gap, because in our time period, we found that the Hispanics' income grew more rapidly than whites, but blacks' income grew less rapidly than whites. Lastly, geography does not explain much of the white-black gap, because they are not living in more unaffordable areas compared to whites, but substantially explain the white-Hispanic gap. So to tease out the geography effect, we also did some decomposition exercise at the state level. So these are the state level white-black gap decomposition. And so the dark blue is the state level decomposition numbers, and the light blue is the national decomposition numbers. So we look at 4 different states: California, New York, Texas, and Illinois. So basically, it suggests that for more expensive states like California and New York, geography contributes substantially to the white-black gap, possibly because they are living in more expensive pockets or counties within those states. So that's pretty much what
There we go. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to be a discussant. I'm Dab Vandenbroek from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. My experience is that I'm mainly a data guy, having helped run the American Housing Survey for quite a long time. And so what I will be talking about mainly is the data aspects of the two papers. I do need to mention, of course, that everything I say is my own opinion and does not reflect the official positions of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development or the federal government in general. Both of the papers take the position that ownership is a good thing. It's important to think about why that might be. There are consumption benefits that come to owners, just as in any good or service that one might consume. There are social benefits that have been ascribed to ownership in terms of superior citizenship and participation in neighborhood organizations and that sort of thing. There are child rearing benefits, better education outcomes, less drug use, less teen pregnancy, less juvenile delinquency. The outcome that both papers really focus on more is the wealth creation, the forced savings caused by home ownership. There are better financial instruments for getting a rate of return than house price appreciation. But the advantage of ownership is that your investment is tied to your domicile. And so it's a lot harder to skip your rent payment than to decide, or your mortgage payment, than to decide, well, we're not going to put money into our mutual funds this month. And so in terms of consistency, having a mortgage is a good spur to continuing consistent investment in wealth than other possible forms of wealth accumulation. Now, first I'm going to look at Jen Hung Choi's aggregate statistics, mainly at the MSA level. And she demonstrates the dramatic drop in Black home ownership since the Great Recession. And that part is not really surprising because everybody's ownership rates kind of dropped during the recession. The really surprising part is the stubborn lack of recovery and indeed continued drop in some cases since that time. She reviews the underlying factors, and I think we're all pretty much familiar with those. Her Metropolitan analysis, her regressions are kind of interesting. She shows smaller gaps in the South than in the Midwest and in New York. You'll notice that list of the best and the worst places for gaps. All the small gaps were in the South, and the big gaps were either in the Midwest or in New York State. And I found that pretty interesting. I think there'd be scope there for decomposing that multivariate analysis to find out if that explains these gaps or if there's something particular to those regions going on that would require more examination. Now, the regression results themselves, the coefficients come out about as you would expect. Older households, married households, households that have more income or education all tend to have higher ownership rates than the opposite. There are some surprises. One is that it's not so much higher income households, but the concentration or lack of concentration in the lowest quartile of the income stream that has an effect on ownership. That's kind of interesting. And also the fact that the segregation measure, the exact phrase has just come out of my head, but the segregation measure disappears as an important factor when you bring in FICO scores. And so that's pretty interesting. Also, the MSA fixed effects contribute to that. So that's something that also I think should be looked at more closely. Now, one point that hasn't really been brought out in these discussions is the fact that over a considerable period of time, but certainly more so in this long recovery we've had since the Great Recession, the distribution of income and wealth have both been skewing further and further towards the high end. And I think perhaps these distributional effects have a contribution to this ownership gap that we're seeing. Since Black households have been in the middle to lower end of the income and wealth distributions anyway, the advantages of the recovery, such as they have been skewing more and more towards the high end and leaving the middle and the lower end further and further back. So that might have some contribution to this continuing problem. Now, turning to the Acklin-Lynn-Wachter paper, it uses American Housing Survey data, and of course I have a lot of experience with the American Housing Survey. American Housing Survey is a wonderful data set for housing conditions. It is pretty weak at income. It doesn't have most of the kinds of variables you'd want for predicting people's income in terms of labor force participation, that sort of thing. It has really nothing about wealth. And so that's a weakness if you're trying to get at how wealth and income affect the propensity towards home ownership. There are a few variables that perhaps were neglected or couldn't fit into the regressions very well. AHS does ask about the source of down payment. One of the responses there is inheritance or gift. This gets at this intergenerational transfer issue that's been touched on a little bit here and there. And so that would have some insight into the wealth effect of receiving some help from previous generations. The AHS also does ask the wage and salary of every person in the household, and so you could at least get a count of how many people are earning an income, which would contribute a little bit more towards predicting that permanent income measure. And similarly, in 1989 and 2005, we had Journey to Work modules. That's mainly about commuting, but in order to find out who's commuting and how far they're going, we have to ask, oh my goodness, I'm running out of time. So let's just keep moving here. There is this discussion of permanent income. I had a big discussion about what permanent income means, which I can't talk about right now. But the point here is that if AHS is not very good at predicting income, then a lot of what's being called transient income is really just error in measuring permanent income, and you have to be careful about what those things mean. This is a very intricate model in which you have estimates feeding into further estimation, and so the econometrics of this is kind of interesting, and I wish I could comment on that more. I like the way they take the counterfactual estimates by taking white households and plopping them into the black equations and getting a kind of difference in difference things. I think that's a really good way of measuring the residuals. One thing that I want to point out is that the AHS has gotten very good at linking other data sets to AHS records in terms of administrative data and other census surveys now. And so it's certainly possible to bring in this additional data and link it to AHS records to do a better job of estimating some of these gaps that the AHS is not capable of doing. The downside of that is that you have to use confidential data, which means you either have to get sworn status and go to the Census Bureau to do your work, or you have to give us your code and have us do the regressions for you, which can be really awkward when you're in the middle of your work. But we have done this for other people, and so this is another way to add to the data that is already being used. So thank you very much for letting me comment, and here's my contact information. My office can practically be seen from the windows over here. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what happens in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all for your great presentations, and for everyone in the audience. We give you lunch and then go through all this data, so I hope you're able to stick with us. This is a lot of information that's being presented. This is really important because there is a lot of really good, important work that is happening all over the country from both academic, scholarly perspectives, studying these issues. In the civil rights community, in the advocacy community, in the policy community, as well as practitioners, lenders, realtors, and others who are really focused on trying to understand how we address this issue. And as you can see from all the data points, it's complicated. And there are a lot of underlying factors. Housing in and of itself, it's just like wonderful if we could just figure out a way to get everyone a house, but there are so many underlying factors in terms of the household formation, how the household's formed, demographic considerations, geographical considerations, and the like. And so I think what I'd like to talk about a little bit more in our discussion before we turn it over to the audience is just trying to get a little bit deeper on some of the really critical issues that have bubbled up, not only in the research we have heard today, but in other critical pieces that you all have probably been seeing as you follow this issue more broadly. So I think I'll start, Jung, with you. Urban's research to date, as well as your new work that you presented today, suggests that the dynamics of homeownership of the gap are localized, and place does matter, and in determining how to address those issues, policy considerations at the city or metro level should be looked at. This seems key. Your maps on the Black homeownership gap I found interesting, and this was mentioned by Dav, is that the metros in the South seem to be doing better than in other places. What are your thoughts on this, and why do you think that this is?
So yeah, we did realize that when we were also running the regression analysis in this version, we didn't capture the share of Black households by MSA, but if we include that variable in, we do find that places with greater share of Blacks have higher Black homeownership rate, which also leads to a smaller gap between the city, the white home ownership gap. So the reason that we didn't include that variable in, because it's highly correlated with all the other variables, so it was like giving weird signs for some of the other variables, but we thought that was really interesting to look into. The thing that we need to do after this version of the research is look more closely into some of the specific MSAs. For example, in places with greater share of Black population, there might be some policies that sort of promote home ownership. I think also there could be some like information or network effects that sort of like Blacks living in a more highly concentrated Black MSAs have maybe better home ownership about access to home ownership. So these are a couple of things that we are planning to look into. And also if you have any suggestions of your thoughts about, okay, these I think are the key variables that would affect Black homeownership rate in some of the MSAs that have more concentrated Black population, please let me know after the data talk.
Thanks. So I'm going to go to Arthur and Susan on your piece. Your research showed that the reasons, I kind of got a sense of the reasons for the lower homeownership rate are different for Blacks and Hispanics. This is something we've been talking about, which is why we haven't been kind of just globally talking about the minority homeownership rate. We are breaking it down because of those differences. Can you just talk a little bit more about how you might recommend approaching the issue differently, or and what kinds of reasons behind these variations might exist?
Well, let me start. The dynamics of the recovery or the lack of recovery since the recession affects these two demographics very differently, obviously. So that, it seems to me, is key in any explanation going forward. We see Black wage growth just now, but still it's way behind wage growth in Hispanics. So that may be a definitive explanation right there. But I also want to turn back to Arthur in terms of Hispanic isn't even itself one group. It's they're very different outcomes, so perhaps you want to.
Yeah, and the Wall Street Journal piece yesterday was pointing out that Hispanic neighborhoods have had a much stronger recovery in terms of house prices than Black neighborhoods. And that has a whole set of outcomes in terms of ability to move, ability to become homeowners, and so on. But to go back to the heterogeneity piece between places like Florida versus the West Coast, you have also very different housing market, very different condition. But one of the big differences that we would like to explore further between Hispanic household and Black household, and going back to Dave's piece, is really the number of earners per household and how that can support a mortgage application if you have more earners per household, making you a stronger applicant. And so that can contribute to that increase that we have seen in recent years for Hispanic.
Thank you. So one of the, and I'll come to you, Jaya, you also made some interesting observations about geography that I think are worth kind of lifting up and talking about from your research. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of how you think we might approach these populations, and coming from your perspective and being part of Freddie Mac, which has a big role to play in solving for the problems here. that we're talking about, how would you approach these populations to help them better access homeownership? What is your research kind of telling you and the organization?
Right. So basically, our research found that there's several ways these minorities have similar experiences. They have lower credit profiles, which is kind of, causing a lot of gap. But then they also have different experiences. Like, for example, family structures matters more for blacks, whereas for Hispanics, geography is a key piece, which is contributing to the homeownership gap. So I guess that the two populations, in some ways, they have to be treated in similar way. For example, credit education opportunities, counseling can help them build their credit and go up the home ownership ladder. But then the other ways, where, even though lenders cannot really influence factors like family structure, but they should be well aware of the differences in how these differences and how credit policies may interact with these differences. In terms of geography, like overcoming that barrier, there are several down payment products, low down payment products that lenders should facilitate these potential borrowers so that they can get into the homeownership ladder. So I guess like there are multiple strategies to deal with this minority group. So in the short term, lenders should be geared, focus at like what we call the mortgage ready population, who have the credit as well as income to get into mortgages as well as afford houses in their areas. So try to understand what are their barriers, like is it low down payment products, do they need low down payment products, or do they need a saving strategy? So in the medium term, they can focus on the minority groups who are thin files with no derogatory credit, and try to like try to use alternative methods to assess their credit worthiness. For example, alternative credit scoring methods, or rent statements, bank statements, to assess their credit worthiness. Because there has been a lot of research, FDIC survey suggests that minorities don't tend to trust banks as much since the crisis. So they don't really, they're like, I'm done, I'm not going back. So they don't really want to go back and to use the same ways they used previous to crisis. So you have to like use different methods to assess their credit worthiness. And in the long term, the lenders and real estate professionals can focus on those who have derogatory credit, so that they can get rid of their derogatory credit from their histories and build their credit and bounce back. So yeah.
Great, very helpful. Dave, you talked about some of the variables. I just want to talk for a second about data, and then I want to jump into some of the other kind of larger scale macro issues that were mentioned around like student loans. But on the data side, you mentioned some of the variables like source of down payment and things like that. Can you just, that were missing from some of the analysis, can you just talk a little bit about how, you being part of building the American Housing Survey, and then there's so many other public data sets that are available out there for the research that we're hearing about today. Just your perspectives on how to fill these gaps, how to think about them, alternative data sources that maybe we haven't considered that you would recommend.
Sure. I think this paper did a really good job of using what data is in the American Housing Survey. For example, one of the variables that went into the permanent income estimate was the number of vehicles. And so they were trying to define whatever things they could in order to get at this idea of income. Wealth is difficult. There aren't many surveys that get good wealth data. Basically, inside the Census Bureau, anything that has what's called a MAF ID, the master address file, which is basically an address ID, can be linked to AHS records now. And most person IDs can be linked to people who are in the American Housing Survey. So any other surveys that the Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts, or other specialized surveys, could potentially be linked to the AHS. But, you know, as I said in my presentation, the difficulty with doing that is that it's not public data. And so the results might be releasable, but it's awkward to work with that if you're not already a sworn census employee.
Makes sense. So, Jung, the statistic you shared on college-educated graduate blacks having a lower homeownership rate than high school dropout whites was compelling. Any observations or thoughts on why, even though homeownership increases with level of education attainment overall, this might be the case?
Yep. So there's about a couple of recent studies which looks at the relationship between student debt and home ownership. So our millennial home ownership paper also finds that student debt also reduces the millennials to access home ownership. But then more recent studies kind of looked at the black-white gap. And what they found is Center for Responsible Lending actually found that blacks with a college degree are much more likely to default on their student debt than whites. So actually the likelihood of default was about 5 times higher. So with that considerable difference in the delinquency rate, that would actually have some impact on their access to home ownership. And I also think there's intergenerational aspects here also, like home ownership rate, because like a lot of white students can actually kind of get a support from the parents, which lowers the amount of their student debt. But after graduating, if they have problems of paying their student debt loan, then they also can get some parental support. In many cases, black young adults don't have that opportunity to reach out to their parents in times of difficulty. So that is, I think, another key factors that are leading to a huge discrepancy between the delinquency rate of student loans. So it's not just the amount of student loan itself, it's also about problems of paying back the student loan, which is also probably negatively affecting the black young adults to access homeownership rate. We do need to do more research on that. So these are some of the recent preliminary findings, which kind of shows, could be one of the factors why college degree blacks have significant, even lower homeownership rate than high school dropout white population.
Thank you, Susan and Arthur. Your work also looked at returns on education by race. What observations do you have about how big an issue education and student debt will be, especially for millennials and younger generations?
Well, this isn't specifically in our research, but I think it's extremely important in any consideration of student debt, which many studies have pointed to its implications for becoming homeowners. And that is, it's not student debt overall so much as it's the combination of student debt without graduating. And so a large segment, and it seems to be greater for minorities, of not graduating and therefore not seeing the pickup in the wage. That actually student debt is, for many people, a good investment if you graduate and get the higher income, but it's certainly a very bad investment if you don't. And so attacking that issue, I think, is extremely important, and particularly important for minorities.
Just add, yeah, but so the Center for Responsible Lending actually did compare Hispanic and Black, and for Hispanic, they did point out that it's the people who do not complete the college education that is affecting the relationship between student debt and home ownership. But then Black population, they actually find that even among those who graduated, because they also, after graduating, they default so much on their student loan, that is also, even for those who actually completed the college education, they still kind of lag behind home ownership because of that.
The implications on credit, right? Yeah. So I'll just ask one final question. I'm going to turn over to the audience to ask your questions. So start queuing them up if you have them, so that you can, I think mics will come around to you guys. I want to just talk about how we solve for some of this and what policies might be useful. We've done some work, thanks to support from the National Association of Realtors, National Association of Real Estate Brokers, Quicken Loans, and others, looking at and making some recommendations around points where we should be focused on solving this problem and this growing issue on the black-white homeownership gap. And historical government policy we know has really helped people in the past achieve homeownership. When we look back in history at the history of the FHA, I think many of you are very familiar with this and maybe Richard Rothstein's work on the role of FHA and helping create segregated neighborhoods. Your paper, Richard and Susan, you talk a little bit about and you discuss these historical policies, but also just talk about the things that have been put in place, the GSE's affordable housing goals, the Community Reinvestment Act, which went into effect 40 years ago. Lots of different things that have gone into place over time, yet we still find ourselves here. I'd like to understand your thoughts on where to focus, where to be thinking about. What is your research suggesting that from a policy standpoint we might need to be looking at? And maybe Susan, you can start, and others can jump in on that, and then we can go to discussion.
Well, as I suggested, that there were some very good things happening in the period of late 1990s to 2003, prior to the housing bubble. And that was a period of vigorous enforcement of the Credit Reinvestment Act. The Credit Reinvestment Act has weakened over time simply because of the tremendous growth in non-banks, as well as other reasons, withdrawal of large banks. And right now, the CRA is being rethought and relooked at, and I think it's extremely important to keep in mind these long-term inequalities as we re-envision the future of the CRA. Similarly, obviously, we don't have reform of the GSEs, and if Lori's right, we won't have it in the lifetime of anyone in this room. Lori's usually right, so there we are. However, I do think that reform, if we do have it, and where we are now, does also have consequences for the ability to close this gap. For one, we have a 90-point guarantee fee today, or so. I'm wrong, I'm missing that. But in any case, the guarantee fee is far higher than it was. It should be higher. But it's not just a guarantee fee, it's a differential across groups in terms of pricing mortgages. There are LLPAs, there are differences in insurance PMIs. They all add up. Over time, if we have a more stable housing finance system, then the perception of risk in the housing finance system should decrease. But right now, we don't have stability in our future guise because we don't know what the outcome of the future reform of the housing finance system is. But if we have a stable system, then this instability risk premium should, in fact, decline over time. So it's tremendously important how we reinvent the housing finance system, how we reform the GSEs to allow cross-subsidization, which actually increases homeownership across the ladder for all, and also to enable stability. We have done work with the National Association of Realtors that points to a utility model could deliver stable outcomes. No matter what, we do need stability because minorities pay for instability.
Go ahead, Arthur.
But and in the meantime, there are things that can be done in terms of looking further into alternative credit scoring, as was mentioned a minute ago. There's a lot of information that is left off the table that could be captured, that could qualify more households. Yes. So alternative credit measures, better capturing some of those income that are unstable. With the digitization of a lot of flux of information, we could do a better job at qualifying some of those households that are left out while waiting for long-term reform.
I put that under the umbrella of just modernizing underwriting standards to use things that make sense, variability in income, potentially looking at rent and the work, the
utility bill.
Exactly. So that's definitely a key point in looking at alternative credit, and also just given the significance we see that credit scoring has, and in this new age of technology and AI and everything else that's happening, I think this ability to really advance that conversation is really important. I think we have time for one question or maybe two from the audience. So let's get hands, and I think mics will come to you. David? Sure. since you're right next to a mic.
Thank you. This has been a fabulous session, incredibly useful. So I have a bit of a multi-part question, but I won't give a speech. First of all, how big is the map in mortgage-ready population? If you just look at people who are mortgage-ready now. The other is how much is marital status linked to income, potentially dual incomes? And then if we control for the minimum income required to afford the bottom quartile of a housing price, first-time home, how big is the gap on that? And similarly, what would be the impact if you added FICO?
Do you want to start?
So yeah, I can take the mortgage ready part. So basically at Freddie Mac, we have done tremendous work to size the homeownership potential across different race and ethnicity and different demographics. So we have, using basic underwriting standards, we define mortgage ready. So basically we call someone who's a non-mortgage owner but has a credit characteristics to qualify for mortgage is a mortgage ready. So if you have FICO score above 620, no bankruptcies, delinquencies, and severe delinquencies and foreclosures, and your debt to income is less than 25, then you are potentially mortgage ready. So we have sized mortgage ready population across different demographics, and we have found that the racial gap persists even in the homeownership potential. So for example, I think for non-Hispanic whites, it's around 32%. And for blacks, I think it's around 19% is mortgage ready. So I can confirm on that number and get back to you. So the gap persists. And they're also, within the mortgage weak sector, we have tried to understand what is making them mortgage weak. Is it severe delinquencies, or like what part of mortgage weak is due to severe delinquencies in their history? Or is it because they have thin file but no derogatory credit, so it's like clean thin files, or they have no FICO. So we have done a waterfall like that. So we found that, so definitely most of the mortgage weak population is due to severe delinquencies, and African American share of mortgage weak who have severe delinquency is much larger compared to the non-Hispanic whites. But then the clean thin file sector is huge for the minorities. So there is a huge chunk of minorities who are mortgage weak, but don't have any derogatory credit. They just don't use credit as a tool. So they don't have enough credit history. They don't use credit as a tool. So there should be some other strategies to evaluate their credit worthiness using alternative credit scoring methods, or looking at their utility statement. They could be either too young, or they could just not use credit as a tool. Like I said, they don't trust banks anymore. So yeah, so that's my 2 cents.
I'm going to get one more question in here.
I wanted to ask, and it was really generated from some of your research, how much you think marketing, outreach, the PR aspect is also a factor here. I mean, if you look at the GSEs at their height, they had 52 local offices, spent $5 million on minority real estate. There was a lot more dealing with effective intermediaries and capacity building. A lot of that is no longer exists. And I will say, as a black homeowner in a black neighborhood, it's easy to really be, as an individual, neutral about home ownership, given that experience. The crises was the worst in my neighborhood compared to the rest of the state. The recovery has been the worst, the slowest, still not fully recovered, a lot of negative equity. And other asset prices have really went up, relatively speaking, in terms of wealth building. And so I'm just, it's easy to be neutral about it as a black person, as a black family, or just based on that experience. And so I was just be interested in your thoughts about that, marketing, PR.
Thank you very much, because that's an extremely important point, which we didn't mention. And it is along with credit quality, credit score, because credit quality and credit score are different, and we're using a pretty rigid credit score approach right now, as opposed to these alternate mechanisms which could get at credit quality better, more accurately. But along with that is the soft outreach. And we've heard minorities don't trust banks anymore. We've heard where there are networks of minorities, there's more home ownership. These are indications that understanding networks really do matter. And the complexity of becoming a homeowner is the most complex decision any of us will ever make. So yes, we do need this kind of outreach. And any counseling that can be combined to make the homeownership sustainable over the long run will be beneficial for everyone. And we do have more recent studies, that one particularly from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, which points to the importance of counseling.
I do want to mention that HUD has continued to maintain a housing counseling program. In 2015, the AHS did a topical module about that, and they found that of the people who participated, a large majority thought it was a very positive and useful experience. So HUD at least is trying to cover that gap.
Thank you. So we're out of time. I want to just say thank you to the panel. I want to thank you all for doing this research. I know it takes a lot of time, and it's really important for the field that we continue to elevate these issues. I want to mention two things. One is we have a Black Homeownership Summit happening in Atlanta, actually, at the Urban Institute's Housing Finance Policy Center, partnering with the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Jimmy Carter Library on August 28th. We're very excited about that. Many of you in this room will be there or participating in that in some way. That's going to be a really incredible summit. The other thing I wanted to mention was our housing symposium. Annual housing symposium is back this year at the Urban Institute. It will be right here, and it's going to be on October 23rd. So please, if you haven't already, mark your calendars, and if you're needing to travel or be anywhere on that day, be in DC, right here. And please join me in thanking this panel for their work and for a great discussion.
All of us,
And if, I know